I'd like to welcome you to part 3, which continues where we left off, of course, in part 2. And we'll just begin and get right into it. Another aspect of this life about which there's rightful concern is the fact that there may be times in our lives when we feel overwhelmed by some of the dark times that may come and by the feelings that we may experience at such times. Now, for some persons, the difficulty of experiencing and dealing with such things seems greater than it does for others. There are feelings of loneliness or inner emptiness that we may all experience at times. These can often be helped by the knowledge that although we may at times feel lonely, we are never really alone. We all have unseen guides that are always there. These guides, sometimes called guardians, are constantly working with our own higher self to guide and watch over us throughout our lives. We will discuss these guides somewhat more at length when we later talk about the subject of angels in a later video. Excuse me. The knowledge that we are never alone, however, should provide a great deal of reassurance to those who may be particularly troubled. In addition, it should also be pointed out that the feelings of inner emptiness can begin to be filled when we open our minds and hearts more and more to truth and spiritual light and invite both in. Our awareness that we are on a very special journey as seekers on the path can also go a long way toward leaving behind any feelings of emptiness or loneliness. We must not forget, however, that meeting, overcoming, and mastering the difficulties and the problems of this life, thereby learning the lessons associated with those difficulties and problems, are the main reasons why we've chosen to come here and incarnate on this physical plane. It's extremely tragic, therefore, that there are some who, when beset by such difficulties, feel so unable to cope that as a result they make the decision to take their own lives. In many instances they do this because they do not realize two important facts. First, we will never be given problems more difficult than we have the capability to handle and deal with. The difficulty at times may be very great, but we are assured that it will never be beyond our ability to deal with it. Those things which may seem also to shake the very foundation of our world at the time that they're happening are very often the same events about which we may reminisce years later with a trace of a smile when we recall how devastating they seemed back then. Time can be a great healer. And secondly, taking one's own life means that the problems which brought that about have not been overcome, much less mastered, and the needed lessons have therefore not been learned. This in turn means that the higher self will eventually have to make the choice to reincarnate here and once again meet those same problems in a different life. This will continue to happen over and over again, if necessary, until those problems have finally been resolved properly and we haven't simply run away from the problem without making a proper resolution. There are additional difficulties, at least some of which will be karmic, that can be brought about by the willful taking of a life, even one's own, and these must also be considered. Taking one's own life simply forces us to endure those same difficult problems over and over again, lifetime after lifetime, until we finally face and overcome them properly. As you can see then, taking one's own life solves nothing and saves us from nothing. The problems can be worked out. We just need to make the effort and get help. It should also be stated at this time, however, that the speaker readily acknowledges the fact that there are persons who have taken their own lives because of their inability to think through difficulties as clearly as they might normally, due to a chemical imbalance in their brain that may have been brought about by bringing drugs, even prescription medication, and or alcohol into their body in such a way and at such a time that these substances bring about or contribute to bringing about the creation of such a chemical imbalance. Even in such cases, however, it is the speaker's feeling that it would be exceedingly rare if such decisions, which would lead to the imbalance, that are made by the individual involved, were made despite input from or the strong influence of the higher self. We are agents of free will, however, at the higher level and at the conscious level. And perhaps such a person may, despite all the efforts of the higher self, succeed in carrying out the decisions leading to the chemical imbalance and the subsequent decision to take one's life, or the subsequent events that cause one's life to be lost as a result of the imbalance. Even with these things considered, however, it should still be pointed out that the additional difficulties that can be brought about by the taking of a life, even one's own, perhaps especially one's own, should always be taken into careful consideration by those persons who may be thinking that suicide could be a way out, when in fact it causes those problems and events to be replayed and relived in a future life or lives. As stated earlier, it solves nothing and saves us from nothing. I believe very strongly and can state with certainty that there really is hope for all of us in this life. I also realize, however, that life can be extremely difficult at times. We're all struggling in one way or another, but that is not really as bad as it sounds, because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the very important reasons that we choose to come here and reincarnate on this planet is so we can experience this life, with the parts of it that are good and the parts of it that seem not to be so good. The reason for this is that we cannot learn the lessons that life here has to offer if we never experience any adversity. Experiencing, overcoming, and mastering life's difficulties are the ways that we learn the lessons that this life makes available to us. These are the lessons that we reincarnate here to learn. If life were only smooth sailing with no adversity, how could we ever learn even to appreciate the calm that follows a storm? Without the storms, how could we learn the lessons that are available for learning only when the storms come? We, on a higher level, choose to come here just so we can learn these lessons of this life. And thankfully, if we miss a few this time around, we're generally going to be getting another chance, and we can choose to return here in order to try again. Some at a conscious level may use this as an excuse to do nothing, because they feel that they can always make up for it in some future incarnation. This, however, is very dangerous thinking, and such a waste. If one continues to think that way in each life, the journey back to God can never be completed, because it's never really begun. What a terrible waste and loss for the one who would make such a choice. Excuse me. When we meet, overcome, and master difficulties in this life, and thereby learn the lessons associated with those experiences, we cannot help but have our lives changed for the better. Our existence changed for the better. Although it's well known that these changes seldom happen over a short period of time, nevertheless, positive changes do begin to take place in our lives, and with a good heart, perhaps a good book appropriate to our place on the path, and a prayer on bended knee with bowed head, and when needed, even the unseen help that comes from higher positive forces, we can make it through even the most difficult of times. I should point out, however, that it is worthwhile to consider asking for that help. There are many who feel that the law indicates that God expects us to do all that we can and then seek Him. I recommend it. There is at least one thing that we can hold on to and remember during those times when our problems seem to be so many and so difficult to overcome. That is the fact that by overcoming and mastering those problems, we are accomplishing those tasks which we have come here to accomplish. The problems that are often associated with getting an education, getting a job, entering into marriage, bringing up children, coping with later life, etc., and the important responsibilities that are associated with each of these phases of our lives are all simply vehicles. Although that's not meant to imply that they're unimportant, but they're vehicles to help us accomplish the deeper reasons why we're here. That of learning those needed lessons that this life has to offer by going through the experiences that are here and here alone. For those few seekers who finally make the decision to dedicate themselves to living a life of service to God, and thereby to one degree or another to their fellow man, they find that this decision often brings about great changes in their lives. For many of these persons it becomes quite a surprise to find that many of the changes that come are not necessarily pleasant to experience. They may have even expected that the opposite would be true. I'll have a little bit more to say about that a little later in the next session. But I do thank you for watching. Part 4 will continue from here.